Yep, now they're it's populating quickly now. So I will go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everybody to the 46th Annual Convention and our Healthcare and Industry and Academia Research Collaboration Panel, and that is jointly sponsored by the Healthcare Innovation SIG from NSBE and the Biomedical Engineering Society. So before we get started with introductions, I want to do a few housekeeping things. As you come on, please mute your audio and turn your video off. Only the host and the panelists and the presentation should be seen. And hopefully you all can see my screen now. Also, please use the chat feature for any questions or issues. If you're having issues with sound or video or anything like that, any issues that may arise, use the chat feature. Chat your questions or issues to everyone. And if there is there's going to be a Q&A breakout session at the end of the webinar. We ask that you wait to share at that time, but if you think you might forget your question, feel free to label it Q&A and go ahead and type it into the chat for everyone to see at this time. And then just kind of have fun, have your questions ready, and enjoy our panel. So before we get started, I wanted to give everybody a little bit of background about HISIG. So as Mr. Thomas, for those of you that were on a little bit earlier, heard him say that HISIG was founded in 2017. And at that point in time, we had a little over 1,000 members, and our membership has grown by 375%. And we're just under 5,000 now, so 4,800, which is huge for a special interest group, because there's some whole societies that may not have that quite that membership. So the mission of HISIG is to promote development and implementation of innovations that will improve diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of injury, illness, and disease. And HISIG employs what we refer to as our CARE strategy. And that strategy involves connecting NSBE members interested in healthcare innovation with healthcare professionals in academia, government, and industry for membership, professional development, and different career opportunities. Also, advancing healthcare innovations through research, development, and commercialization, recruiting and retaining members interested in healthcare innovation, and finally, educating and exposing NSBE members and the Black community to healthcare disparities, innovations, and careers. So I'm excited that you are able to join us today for this panel. And I wanted to introduce the members of our HISIG leadership team, and the vast majority of them, we may be missing one or two that they might have some conflicts this morning, are on the panel today. Our director, Mr. Arthur Edge, and he's Associate Director, Global Technical Operations at AstraZeneca. I am the Deputy Director, and I am currently Interim President, South Carolina Governor's School for Science and Mathematics. Our Programs Chair, Dr. Tanika Jones, and she's Medical Science Liaison at Vericel Corporation. Our Director Emeritus and one of our founders that many of you know, Mr. John Thomas, and he is R&D Engineering Manager at Intent Solutions. Dr. Theodore Nicholson is our treasurer, and he is Director of Engineering at Early Tech Diagnostics Incorporated. Our communications chair, Mr. Tony Black, he's Executive Cloud Architect, Healthcare and Life Sciences Division at IBM. A few more members, our academia chair, Tia Riggins, she's PhD candidate in biomedical neuroengineering at Michigan State University. Our membership chair, Sandra Jones, she's managing principal at SR Jones and Associates. And one of our newest members of our HISIG leadership team, Mr. Ronald McCullough. He's a college administrator and adjunct professor at Atlanta Metropolitan State College. So I want to introduce our panelists today that have joined us from around. Our first panelist is Dr. Tamara Bainham. She's Director of Clinical Research at EBT Medical Incorporated. We also have Dr. Todd Brinton, Corporate Vice President, Advanced Technology and Chief Scientific Officer at Edwards Life Sciences. We have newly minted and defended Dr. Jason Hemphill, Associate Research Fellow at Abbott. And last but most certainly not least, Dr. Julius Corley, and he is Director of Entrepreneurship and Strategic Partnerships in the College of Engineering at the University of Delaware. So welcome to all of our panelists, and a huge thank you again for participating this morning. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can go ahead and get started with our panel. So I'm going to start moderating by asking some questions, and then of course everyone else participating will have the opportunity to ask questions as we continue. So I'm just going to kind of throw one out, and I'll allow the different panelists to answer. So my first question is for any of the panelists: how did you first become involved in industry and academia partnerships?
Yeah, I can start with that. So I had a unique situation as a graduate student. We actually had two different companies co-located at our lab at University of Alabama at Birmingham. So we had scientists from Guidant, which is now part of Boston Scientific, as well as scientists from Physio-Control. That at that time, when I was a graduate student, they were eventually purchased by Medtronic. So they were actually co-located in the lab for me. So, well, I probably had a kind of a warped sense of how things work because, because the industry partnership was kind of in the DNA from where I did my PhD work. And much of my work as an industrial scientist has been either co-developing technologies with academia or managing research contracts with academia. So,
okay, thank you. Anybody else want to jump in and answer that question? How they first became involved?
Sure. My time at Momenta Pharmaceuticals is a startup company based out of MIT. And that's when I first learned of the academic industrial partnerships and how fruitful they could be, because as many of you know, MIT churns out lots of startup companies. And at that point in time, I had no idea the technology flow and how fast a company could just take off. And especially when you had the right academic partnerships. For the startup companies, they leveraged the academic muscle. It's just cheaper to do research in an academic institution. And you were able to then now transfer that technology out of the university and really make it more marketable for venture capital. So that was the beginning. And since that time, my career path has been about leveraging those industrial and academic partnerships.
Okay, thank you.
For me, I got kind of lucky. I started out in my 20s working for a startup company, and we built aluminum electrolytic capacitors that go into implantable cardioverter defibrillators. And it was a startup company, but eventually we got bought by several companies. We eventually became St. Jude Medical, and then eventually became part of Abbott, which was kind of interesting to go through that. But while I was working for that startup company, when we got bought by St. Jude Medical, I got to start looking at working on a master's. I was trying to figure out exactly what field of study I wanted to go into, so they allowed me to go work on a master's in chemical engineering. And I worked on something that both benefited the company and benefited academia. So it was a good collaboration there. We were able to get patents between the different groups and be able to innovate. And I got to work on my thesis, and the company got to have a benefit as well with a new process that was developed. And the big thing was just make sure that we had the contracts working in place, and the IP was properly set up in the front. Who owns the IP, that kind of thing. But yeah, it was very good, and that just kind of got me looking into how could I do that more and more, and see how we can leverage people in the academia field, because there's a lot of great people out there working on various projects, and how can we leverage those technologies and bring those into the company.
I'll add. So I've been on both sides of it. I spent early. I was an engineer and actually was with a startup company, and we were often reaching to academic institutions to solve, to kind of contract out some of the fundamental problems that we had. I then went back to medical school and was eventually went to Stanford and was there for 15 years, where we worked the other way, where often we were doing startup companies, much like other people said, and spinning out technology. Those spin outs were often being funded by venture capital, and I was involved on the academic side, but then I was a venture partner ultimately with a venture group. And now I sit in industry at a larger company, and we have lots of relationships with academic institutions. In fact, including MIT and several other that are kind of looking at fundamental problems that we're trying to solve. So I think the richness of having both of these things is very different than I thought when I was in academia and thought that everything was about NIH funding. That it was all government funding and government grants. The reality is that majority of the funding today, I think, is privately funded. It's either funded through venture capital and company structures, or they're grants that are coming from larger companies. And I think that the richness of that relationship and being able to learn some of the complexities with those relationships is pretty fundamental to moving forward, both technology, but also fundamental to people understanding where there's career opportunities.
Thank you. And you, Dr. Britton, you actually kind of are transitioning into my next question. I know it's probably been about 10 years that I'm outside of working on industry and academia partnerships. So my next question to the panel is, how have academia and industry research partnerships changed in the past 5 to 10 years? And how do you predict, second part of that question, that they will change in the next decade or so?
I'll jump in again first, and then I'll let other people follow. I think one of the challenges early in any of these relationships between academia and industry is always the battle that goes on contracts for intellectual property. And I think that, when with the best of intentions, it seems straightforward. All of a sudden, we've got lawyers involved, and usually the question of who owns what that's created by the partnership. I think those in some institutions, those have streamlined. I think there's a lot more understanding of that this is a really important and effective way to get things done and to advance technology. And therefore, certain institutions, I think, do better at this than others. Some of them have plan setups that are just kind of boilerplated and say, this is the plan. If something's co-developed, this is the licensing plan. They've thought through it well enough that it really speeds up the process. I would say that certain institutions are very interested in doing this type of work, and as a result, I think they have an infrastructure that really moves things along. Other institutions with the best of intentions really aren't interested in doing this kind of work because they have other commitments or other priorities, and as a result, they're not really interested in moving things along. I think they look at it as what they have to lose as opposed to what they have to gain. So I think you have to find and maneuver your way through institutions that are structured nicely to kind of make this efficient, and that how will they change in the future? I think this is going to become more and more of where we go. I think that partnerships between industry, this kind of collaboration, the richness of this collaboration of having scientists, particularly, and industry often identifying where the problems are, being incentivized to try and solve those problems, particularly in healthcare for patients. And the richness of really going deep into especially scientists and engineers that are actually in industry and in academia and trying to leverage them. I think this is just going to become more and more common.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll chime in. So I totally agree with what was just said. You can see the industry has changed so much. When I was first involved with my first startup company, that was around 2001. And at that time, we had very little partnerships with academia in terms of the contracts for different portions of projects, et cetera. But once I started my own company about 10 years later, that amount had nearly doubled. So most of the companies that I knew of, they were working virtually, and they had academic contracts where they had much of the actual lab work done, and they were getting all the data back in and processing it. So I do agree with Todd that one of the big hurdles for some academic institutions is all around intellectual property. And here at the University of Delaware, that's kind of why my position was created, because we've come up with creative ways to be able to work with industry. I think the university, and particularly the College of Engineering, looks at industry partnerships as potentially a different revenue stream other than the grant cycle, and it has been largely untapped. So now we're focusing on that. And one of the big things that we're doing is we're making it easier for companies to actually take all the intellectual property created. It costs more, but it's an opportunity cost for the company, and it seems to be more palatable than the long, intense contract negotiations. I'm brought to mind now is we work with the University of Fribourg, and they have this center called the Adolf Merkley Institute, and they have a very simple strategy in terms of licensing technologies to industry. If you come and want to work with them, you pay their, I think, 60 to 70% overhead rate, and you can get all the intellectual property created from your technology. Anything less, they have another agreement where it's maybe a 40 to 20% overhead rate, but then it's co-owned. It's really simple, and companies know exactly what they're getting when they come in. So there's typically no hang up in a negotiation. So that seems to be working in the European area. So now we're hoping to come up with some simple strategies like that here.
Thank you. Anybody else want to answer that one?
And
I was going to say that, I agree with all of that. Looking at the trajectory from when I started my first industry job in 2003 to now, in the beginning, you had companies and organizations, academic organizations that weren't really used to kind of sharing IP. And so it was a little difficult at some places, but at some places it was easier. Mm-hmm. And more it's getting easier because universities like Dr. Corley just mentioned are really starting to see this as another revenue stream because, government funding there's a long timeline before you can get that grant funding. So, to kind of fill those gaps in funding, that's been one of the main ways that universities have started to streamline their processes and make it more advantageous to have those partnerships.
Jason,
I definitely agree with all of that. Contract negotiations, that's a huge part of it going forward, and it seems like it's more and more of a milestone that has to be hit. And one thing too that I've noticed is the strengthening of the workforce and to solve the local needs of the different industries that are around. So for local technical schools and also for local colleges and universities, they're a good source of supply of resources that it's very, very good to always look for, and make sure that you let them know exactly what you're looking for as far as from a workforce. Engineering, different types of engineering, all of those things as well.
Thank you. And we've touched on it a little bit because a lot of these questions are kind of intertwined. In addition to contract negotiation, because I know that's a big one, the knowledge transfer and that intellectual property. What are some other challenges that you all may have experienced during some of your academia and industry partnerships?
I'll take a first stab at that one. Because I've been on all sides of this coin. One of the really big hurdles for these types of partnerships is really academicians. Typically, they write, publish to get grants, to ask more questions, and it's just a repetitive cycle. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. My wife is a professor here at the University of Delaware, so I've seen the cycle. But with companies coming in paying for you to bring forth a deliverable, mm-hmm. that kind of puts academicians out of their comfort zone sometimes. Like, what is a deliverable? You mean I can't just give a no-cost extension, or you can't give me more money because I just need more? the deliverables and especially the product deliverables for what they're been contracting to do is often a challenge. So they're not used to, also, like when I was in a startup company, we met weekly to talk about deliverables that we had to go out, but that doesn't typically happen in a research group here at the university. I mean, I think we're getting better about it because now people like myself have come in kind of given a structure. How do you communicate with industry? The deliverables that you can push and the ones that you can't, and just how to make it a more beneficial relationship. So that's still a challenge because, I mean, if you think about academia, you have the university umbrella, and you have all these CEOs under this umbrella who control their empire if they can get funding to do so. So now you have an outside entity saying, well, you took my money and now you have to do X, Y, and Z. It can be a bit of a touchy relationship to manage.
Yeah, so I would like to piggyback on that. In my very first job, my first project was a contract, and at a research hospital, and the PI there just viewed it like he felt like he had a grant and could do whatever he wanted, but we had a contract. So it was a really good first lesson for me on how to manage expectations. I had to grow up real fast and put my big girl pants on and really stand up really early in my career because of this. It was a really difficult challenge.
Yeah, you're definitely right. You got to have some kind of tangible asset, something that comes out of the academia to show our bosses and our CEOs, and because if we're going to spend all that money, we've got to have some output. And you're right. And also when up front, laying out the scope, and they're going to want to see what is this widget or whatever that comes out of this discussion, and how many widgets are we going to get for this amount of money. And that's a big part of it. Yeah.
I think this to kind of reinforce what was said before early, which was, I think you have to recognize that the goals are different. Having been a professor until recently, the goals really in academia are discovery. I think your goals and your mission is to discover and to go beyond and discover. And the goal, I think, of industry in my mind is to translate. And so as opposed to discovery, it's more translation. There is discovery that goes on in industry. There is direct translation that goes on in academia. But I would say in a more generalized way, I think that broadly, it's really discovery in academia, and it's really translation of those discoveries and discoveries happen into getting technologies to, and we're talking about healthcare here, really ultimately getting technologies to patients. I'm not convinced that academia has the capability the majority of time to really develop a tech, discover it, develop it, and get it to patients without industry being part of it, and vice versa. I don't think the majority of time industry has the ability to discover. With some exceptions, they have some deep discovery capabilities, but really needs the partnership with academia. If it's maybe not the basic discovery, it's a reinforcement or revalidation of the discovery that reinforces it or validates it. And so without both of these pieces and recognizing the fundamental differences, I think you don't really have a chance. Frankly, it's really, really difficult to get something all the way from, as they say, bench to bedside, in a literal way.
Exactly. I think there are probably steps in between. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to mention, and the regulatory agency, that's another big part of all of this.
Great point. Yep.
Yeah.
You've got to get through all of that, and that can be expensive, and that can be a long process. And that's a good thing that helps academia out to get that process or that widget out. That's exactly right.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. I have been, unfortunately, in the other side in academia, which we do not have the capability, in my opinion, 99.9% of the time, to really understand regulatory and how to get things through. We dabble in it, I think, in academia and think that but I think to really understand how to get a technology really, truly into patients, the entire process of safety development, because we think of regulatory as, the trials, right? There's so much about the technology that has to go through a process of, V&V and all these things that are really important part that we just don't have the capability, facilities to do in academia. So that may be the high point you mentioned is the regulatory aspects.
Capabilities nor the money to do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Anything else related to this topic?
We can talk about so many of the challenges.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, you can feel free to share those, or I can flip it now before we start taking questions, because I see we're starting to get some to pop in from the viewers. So my last question was just going to be, we've talked about some of the challenges, regulatory contracts, different things like that, intellectual property. Would you, and I don't know how much you'll be able to share, but could you share some examples of some successes or some highlights from some of your collaborations?
I can talk about one of my earlier projects. So I had a co-development project with a group of scientists at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands, and I was a scientist at Guidant, which is now Boston Scientific in Minnesota. And we both did the animal work. So I did large animal preclinical studies in the lab in Minnesota. Our partners did the small animal studies. We published that jointly in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, so a really high impact journal. And we were also able to develop, had a good intellectual property agreement, and we were able to do the human studies in their hospital at Maastricht. So we were really able to work together in tandem to develop a technology from kind of an idea sitting at dinner at a conference to getting something in a patient. So that was one of the kind of a really good way to kind of get my mind around how this thing can be done right.
Thank you.
Well, not far down the road for me as Clemson University. It's just right down the road, and we've had a lot of postdocs and a lot of good projects that we worked with them throughout the years, and a very good thing is we've got some really good postdocs that's come to work with us over the years, over my last 20-something years I've worked here. And so really the success stories is not only the new process or new thing that we worked on, but just bringing those people in, and now they're longtime employees that continue to contribute to those different projects that they worked on and new projects.
Thanks.
And I'll piggyback off what Jason just said. Being one of the panelists currently in academia, that's one of the things that we look to leverage with these partnerships is being able to create a relationship with the company so that our students that are working on these projects have a place to go immediately after they graduate. For the company, they're able to kick the tires on these new students and figure out, okay, this person has what it takes to make it at the next level. And so it's kind of like a co-op training program, if you will. And for the companies that we're involved with, they love the product that they're getting because now they have people who kind of already know their system and can hit the ground running.
And what's interesting about that is, as you say that, Dr. Corley, that's really how my career has gone. I started out in the lab with these industry partners co-working with us, and throughout my career, they've hired me in several different aspects, whether it be as employees or consultant for them. So that relationship, because we had that early I had that early as a graduate student, I've been able to continue that throughout my career. So it does really work that way.
I'll add that I don't have great specifics, but I can say that Stanford, where I was for 20 years, is a very entrepreneurial institution. I think it's known as being a very entrepreneurial institution. And one of the the cultural benefits of that is we had the Coulter Foundation, which reached, I think there's 20 universities now that have foundational money that they can use to seed projects. We had a Coulter grant program at Stanford where early ideas from academics, that was all from people at Stanford owned intellectual property, was seeded with money from the Coulter Foundation in a very competitive process. We often had panelists sitting from industry and from venture capital that evaluated these early ideas, put money into them, and ultimately then had them go on to develop technology. And I would say that, the Coulter Foundation roughly has $10 million of funding, these grants, and they typically fund roughly a couple $1 million a year. Those investments across intellectual property was developed at Stanford, seeded hundreds of millions of dollars of follow-on funding. So, and ultimately 2 of those have been acquired. So there is a really nice partnership that gets created from the intellectual property that gets developed at places, Stanford just being an example, where faculty and postdocs and grad students can participate in their ideas to then ultimately get money that often you need to kind of bridge the gap early to do some fundamental feasibility or testing or evaluation. Not necessarily just lab, but also some, as someone mentioned, IP evaluation, a few other things to kind of get it ready for external money for venture capital in a way that is being evaluated based on this translational capability as opposed to just discovery. So the merits are different, right? So as opposed to saying, hey, we'll give you more money from the government to go deeper on this discovery idea, this is instead evaluation of early ideas and early inventions and discovery of how translatable they are. And that early money actually translates almost by about, I think if I remember, I may be off, by almost a 20x for the external money that was able to be raised later to then get it translational in. And I said several of those have been acquired. I think one of them went public. So I think there's lots of models that you can use to try and seed early ideas that anybody in academia can have, whether you're a student or a professor, to then bridge this basically in an entrepreneurial way to get these ideas to early startup or to get it acquired basically from a large company.
Dr. Sims, could I follow up on Dr. Britton's?
Sure.
So at Case Western Reserve, we also had one of the Coulter Foundation Awards, $20 million award in talking about transformative. I was there from the very beginning of the program. And in fact, I was a postdoc. My part of my postdoc was funded by the Coulter Foundation. We had a group of academics who knew nothing about translation, but within 5 years of the award, the intense training from the program, I actually became the interim director for that program. The intense training from the program and the venture capitalists, the voice of the customer, industry, all of that into this new ecosystem, it really transformed how our professors at that point looked at translation. So now when they got to the venture capitalists or the angel funding, they really knew how to sell their technology, give deliverables, and show that they had really vetted the technology. So it was no longer proof of concept work, it was proof of principle. It was doing it over and over again and showing that they had something that was scalable and reproducible. So it really transformed the ecosystem, because Northeastern Ohio was known for manufacturing. When that went away, all of these things came together, and that helped to build an ecosystem where you could get biomedical engineering technology out.
Thank you. So thank you all for answering some of my kind of pre-prepared questions. And I notice now in the chat, we're starting to get questions from the people that are joining us for the panel. So I will throw the first one out. It says, how can NSBE members who are professors or undergraduate, undergraduate or graduate students generate new technologies while balancing their academic requirements and preparing to pursue a career in industry or entrepreneurship interests?
Okay, I'll jump in and try and answer that. It's interesting. I think that there is always a balance, as I think has been brought up, between kind of your fundamental responsibility to the institution in discovery and the opportunity to be entrepreneurial or to develop technology and translate it. I think, to be very honest, it depends on the institution. There are institutions that really don't want their faculty spending their time necessarily. At least that's the culture some places, unless we can kind of move things along and change that. And other institutions, frankly, are very open to it. Stanford is notoriously known as being a very encourages really translational opportunities, really wants the intellectual property spun out of the university and having it developed, and has a very really novel structure for how they license and participate. The other thing is this conflict of interest issue that comes up, which is that because this is in healthcare, there's somehow a conflict of the university being involved in innovation and industry. And I think that some institutions have found a way to manage that very clearly, and say, look, the goal is to get to patient care, and whether that is through basic discovery and grants and developing things, ultimately, or developing by translating and spinning out technology and having it licensed, the goals are the same. And so we feel good about managing the conflict of interest. Other institutions, I think, are not as far advanced, and I think foundations like Coulter, I have really helped come into institutions and create a cultural change that not only were these opportunities for more funding, but opportunities to develop people and train them so that they could learn how to translate. And so if you are, with the Biomedical Engineering Society, I think there are programs at the meetings and the annual meeting on translation. I was at a center at Stanford, the Biodesign Center, for 15 years. And then we taught a lot about how to teach faculty how to translate and how to develop their ideas, how to structure them in a way that was not necessarily like they were looking for fun to really develop translation and not necessarily just trying to form a company. And I think it's how you position it. So I think there are resources now. They're becoming more and more common. So there's things to go look at the BMES. And I think there's things, certainly I would look to institutions that have Coulter Foundation funding, because they've definitely built the infrastructure. And if your institution has that, I think I would go to it as soon as possible as a way to kind of develop these skills and capabilities.
I'd like to kind of piggyback on that. So EBT Medical is a company that was spun out from a professor's work at the University of Toronto. So basically what he has done is, throughout his career at University of Toronto, the university kind of worked with him so that he would be able to meet his publishing requirements, but also pay attention to disclosure so that he could develop intellectual property. So he was able to spin out the company, I think maybe 5 years ago to start, and we're a venture back, so we were able to get venture funding. And the thing about it is, it's the university, and actually Canada is really focused on making sure that life science companies work. So we have a lot of resources from the Canadian government as well as the university to make sure that this thing works. So it really has to do with the ecosystem and the environment that you're in. You have to be in an environment that is amenable to your entrepreneurial goals.
I would completely echo that. I think the environment is essential. That environment does build the culture at the university, whether there's a culture there and whether there's opportunities. And I think they vary.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess two parts for this. Professors in entrepreneurship. Promotion and tenure for a professor are sometimes difficult when you have entrepreneurial aspirations. At some schools, there are no problems, but right now, for the most part, promotion and tenure documents don't recognize entrepreneurial activities at all. NSF is now performing a study, I think, maybe with Oregon State or WashU, some West Coast university, to get all academic institutions to formally adopt that entrepreneurial activities are part of research and scholarship. So once that goes forward, that'll be a big help, because now your academics will they won't see it as them wasting their time. And it typically wasn't even them seeing it as they're wasting their time. It was the traditionalists who didn't do any entrepreneurial activities. So if something came up short in their promotion and tenure package, it's because you were focusing on entrepreneurial activities and not the research, the teaching, and the scholarship that you get promoted and get tenure on. So that's one thing. So I think when that happens, it will be a big boost for translational activities all over academic universities. The other thing is, and it's akin to what Dr. Brenton was saying about the Culture Foundation, yeah, there are 20 or so technology partners, but another program very similar to the Culture program is NSF I-Corps. And they're changing, they've moved to a new model now, so where you have, they're calling them NSF I-Corps hubs. And I actually just participated in one of those, applying for one of those, but there are gonna be 5 put in different regions each year. And it's another opportunity for you to get engaged in those entrepreneurial aspirations and get the training that you need to enhance your idea and your ability to speak on your idea. I think there are, and the great thing about the new hubs, you don't actually have to be a part of the university who is funded by the hub. You can just come to them as a community partner and participate in the different hubs. So it lowers the bar for being able to get involved with those universities who are a little bit more advanced in entrepreneurial activities. And you can find all that information just by Googling NSF I-Corps and going to the website, because NSF does a great job of telling you the entire map of all the I-Corps sites, the nodes, and the hubs that will be named.
We have a follow-up question, Dr. Corley. Is there a way that, or some feedback or leverage that you would have that NSBE would be able to communicate with universities to help some of the professors gain industry experience? Could you see a collaboration that might be able to form there?
I mean, anything is possible. I think, you know, it's all about the value proposition.
Okay.
And I'm not gonna give you a crash course in business.
Right.
Value proposition for your different stakeholders, they're always different. And finding that unique value proposition that speaks to that potential strategic partner is imperative. You need to be able to speak their language. Like when I'm trying to sell something here at the university, if I have funding to do it, it's an easy sell. But now, if I don't have the funding to do it, I need to be able to bring something to the table that they don't already have.
Right.
Finding that unique value proposition that will help you overcome that hurdle. And you use that information in all facets of life when you're trying to negotiate, when you're trying to get internships. Like for instance, sometimes professors don't have money for you to get the research experience that you may want. Sometimes you just have to volunteer some sweat equity into the project, and maybe it turns into something else. So there's always a way.
Okay, thank you. Did anyone else want to jump in? Otherwise, I can go to our next question. Yeah, they're coming, popping through. This is our next one. How do you balance who works on these efforts in these partnerships when the intellectual property that is developed is going to be solely for the company? And then a second part of that question, will that limit the exposure that graduate students have, particularly PhD graduate students have to the process?
So typically, oh, go ahead.
No,
I was just going to say, at least on the business side, I've seen it where allow the PhD student or the postdoc to present to us. I think it's a great experience. Let them present their topics, their ideas, and really let us see that. It's great exposure, and they can see in the minds of those people in the industry, and just to see exactly what they're looking for, and try to see a different viewpoint. I think that's very important.
I was going to say that I think it is something to be aware of. So let me give you an example. When I was at Stanford, we had, I mentioned this program called the Bayer Center for Biodesign. And it was a center where we often brought people as an academic innovation training center for people that are interested in healthcare innovation. And the program often brought people together. We paired up with a department each year, ophthalmology, orthopedics, cardiology, and went deep and did observations and looked and tried to evaluate needs. And often when we got to the stage of brainstorming, they would say, well, we put together, we were going to ask some people to join us. One of the conflicts often was, who are you asking to join you? Because if they were a Stanford employee, they were often covered over the licensing, right? And an agreement, everyone had signed an agreement that basically said that the results of your work were owned by Stanford. But commonly you'd have, Stanford would have an open hospital, and we'd have outside experts and engineers there in the community. If you ask them to potentially participate in, some of these projects, then when it came to really evaluating whether you had something that was valuable on the IP side, then the question would be, if everyone's responsibilities to assign to Stanford, there's no conflict, right? Everything moves forward, it's great. But as soon as you had one person who wasn't necessarily had a duty to assign, then you had a problem, because then they had to negotiate the rights to that intellectual property with an individual to try and combine it with Stanford intellectual property. So we would commonly say, make sure that the people you're working with early are people who basically are under the same agreement, that they belong to and they have a requirement to assign to the university. And I know this seems like it's working against you, because it should be about developing the best idea. But it's funny how I saw a couple different projects over the 15 years I was, where there was someone who participated, commonly a physician, who said, this is such a great idea. No, I'm not willing to accept the agreement of the distribution of funds basically from the IP, and it basically killed it. Ultimately, the university said, we're not going forward, and that project never went forward. So it is a necessarily kind of a necessary evil to figure it out up front. It's easy to agree on things when you don't have anything. And I made teams, and we do the same thing in industry all the time. Let's put the rules on the table up front. As soon as people think they have something, everyone's idea of what value is very different. They think, well, this thing's going to be so big, it's going to be, I deserve the A, B, C, and D. And you find huge amounts of conflict between people's ideas of what fairness is, which, by the way, doesn't exist in my mind. It's always about, whether it's equitable. Fairness is just, too much of an opinion. So I think there is something here really important, that if you're going to work with a group, that you make sure that the group you're with, if it's under, contract research work that the industry is funding, that everyone that's there is kind of under the same agreement, so you don't kind of contaminate the process, because it really can't hold up what you want to do. It'll get the lawyers involved, and then when you do that, you're talking about things just get stretched out and much more difficult. So there's enough resources usually, in my opinion, at most universities, that the early work you can kind of get done among the group, and not necessarily thinking like, well, let's go find, somebody else who's an expert in this area outside the university. And the same thing's true for companies. Companies don't want to go out and say, hey, let's go early, unless there's a well-defined relationship, because it basically slows the process down in the long run. If something's successful, it's going to be battled for sometimes years to figure out what the value of it is, as opposed to kind of establishing those things up front.
So I'll take that question from the academic side. It's really important to figure out which types of students are going to work on those types of projects. Oftentimes when the company is going to own all the intellectual property, there's typically publication embargoes. Depending on the university that you're at in your academic advisor, you need to get 1 to 3 papers to graduate with your PhD. Sometimes that's just not possible with those industry projects, because they are looking to make money on them. They're looking to patent them, so you can't just publish, or the publication will be embargoed for maybe like 5 years. So it really depends on, I think, kind of where that particular student wants to go for their career. If they want to be an academic, then that's probably not the project for them, because they need to be able to publish to get to that postdoc area. But if they're interested in having their career in industry, then it's great. It shows them you're essentially getting one-on-one training, especially if you're doing what Dr. Hemphill was saying, presenting to the companies as you're going forward, then they're able to see how you perform and how you will perform once you get the degree in their environment. So it can be beneficial for both sides, but you kind of need to know up front that, you know, there are some pros and cons.
Really good point. Really good. The
Yeah.
embargoes can be really disabling for those, if you're in that developmental stage and you're trying to get publications. And so, you know, I think knowing that there's potentially an embargo, for anybody that's listening to this and you're working on a project, you want to be really clear with your faculty advisor. If there is an embargo in place, know it up front. Really good thought.
Anyone else? Yeah, and thank you all for that feedback. Our next question is, what are some ways that industry can be a better supporter of training and regulatory aspects of development?
I think this is a major deficit we have across the board in industry. You know, I can tell you that we are constantly recruiting for regulatory talent at Edwards. And we have some very, very strong capabilities, but we're a very fast growing company. And as a result, we continue to need to get regulatory talent to the point where we often are bringing people in training programs. So we've got a program where we take undergrads, grad students into a program that we do a developmental program that's basically just on clinical and regulatory for 2 years, and have them do a rotating training program, in a sense, because there's just not enough talent out there to train these folks. And I've started a partnership with a couple of universities to try and develop curriculum in regulatory science. There's a couple of programs that have them that are very strong, but they're very few, and it really limits the supply of regulatory experts that are out there. And I think that, you know, my own bias is that engineers are some of the strongest regulatory people that I've ever worked with. So the way that you develop as an engineer, of the kind of thinking, the process of forming a hypothesis and thinking about, you know, data collection and how it works, is what regulatory is. It's just a step-by-step assessment of kind of thinking about the scientific process and the pieces. And so, and frankly, most of the people that I work with that are in regulatory have been engineers and have come from an engineering background. Some of them are PhD engineers. Some of them are undergraduate engineers that have done other master's work. But I think this is a huge, huge deficit as the healthcare industry continues to grow. We are limited. And so I will tell you that we often will open searches way ahead of time of where our need is, because we know the lead time is so long in finding really strong regulatory capabilities. So again, we're then saying we have to spend money to develop the talent internally, training programs for people and bring them in. And we're actually seeding a couple universities of programs and helping with their curriculum, because it's a necessary capability that the companies need. And so if you're interested in the field that is growing, that you always want to have a growth opportunity, and you love engineering, I would highly encourage you to think about regulatory. You can go a long way, and it is a really strong career trajectory. And right now it is in big demand.
And one of the things that can help you get started is the FDA has some really strong materials on their website for industry and regulatory on the CDRH Learn website. So that's really a good place to start to get your foundation. And the FDA will do workshops at your school. All you have to do is call and ask. They are ready and willing to train folks in doing things the right way. There are a lot of resources out there. People just have to take advantage of them.
For that extra information. So
and just to speak globally as well, the regulatory globally is just changing dramatically all the time. I mean, the TUV organization, it's changing right now, just huge changes all the time. So it's a deficit, and it's something that has to be, you have to stay on top of it. You have to learn all those new requirements and those new needs, because it's becoming a big part of that translation out into the field. It really is.
It's absolutely a continuous learning in this field. There's no, you can't learn something in your program and then think you're set. It is constant and continuous learning.
Yeah, that's why there's now been so many of the master's and certificate programs in the regulatory training, most of them on the West Coast, but I think he's developing one as well. But yeah, it's a very, very exciting career path, and it's growing rapidly because the need and demand will always be there.
Just let me echo. I think I have to be honest, for me, even, you know, as both a clinician and an engineer, and I didn't really understand what regulatory science was. And I thought it's got to be boring. That's the boring regulatory. That's not the fun stuff. And I'd put a shout out to everyone to think, if you're an engineer that's looking for a career path, this is engineering. I mean, our regulatory teams work with the engineering, guide them. They're often the groups that it's really the process of thinking about engineering development. And so it's a very, very fruitful field. And I just think we need a lot more people in it. And if you're thinking about areas you want to go into where you're going to have growth in your career long term, I don't think we're ever going to be overwhelmed by regulatory people. I think we're always going to be behind the 8 ball, basically waiting kind of in a deficit. So I really think that you're going to have to think about, you know, what your opportunities are, and I would just put regulatory science on the possibilities if you're interested in engineering.
For that additional plug there. It's always good to know and share that, especially with people that may be looking for a career change or newly, because we've got such a range with our professionals or people just starting out. We have another question about how should one begin the collaborative partnerships? Should faculty reach out directly to the companies of interest, or should that interaction funnel through a different channel, for instance, the legal counsel at that particular university?
I can tell you how we do it here at the University of Delaware. We've created, I guess, what we call the corporate partnering network. There is a unique way that you need to be able to reach out to industry. And it needs to be strategic, starting locally to those companies, building that network that hopefully open the doors for larger, for a larger spider web, if you will, to be able to connect with those other companies. And what we're finding is there are actually conferences that talk about corporate partnering and show you kind of the things that the really big players do. So we're trying to incorporate some of those things here, but then COVID-19 happened. So a lot of that has been halted, but so one of the strategies that we use, besides reaching out to the local companies, we look at our alumni network. We look at all the touch points that they have in different companies. Because what you really want to do to be able to develop these relationships, the cold calling will only get you so far. What you really need are warm introductions, and typically who's going to be a better seller of your brand from your university than an alumnus. So we try to leverage those relationships. We try to leverage our corporate relations department and corporate development department with looking at all of our students, where they've been placed, looking at the companies we already have relationships with, and we essentially now appeal to the company saying something to the effect of, you already employ 10% of our graduates from this department, and you recruit heavily from X, Y, and Z, to make them see that it's a good idea to work with us and to allow this network to now flourish. Sometimes it works, sometimes, yeah.
Jason, were you going to add something? Did screen freeze? Or?
We can hear you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we can hear you, Dr. Sims.
Okay. Oh, no, I didn't know, Jason, were you about, because you popped on the screen, I didn't know if you were about to answer, or if it just picked up your background.
Oh, I think it just picked up my background.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
that was an excellent response. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. From our, moving on to our next question, to what extent have university centers focused on translational and applied research begun to play an effective role in advancing technology into industry and practice, and how can they improve?
I think, like we mentioned previously, I think academic institutions, and I think they vary, are playing a big role. I think it depends on the institution, but whether it's early, I mean, the real growth is several people brought up is early startups, and you know the path generally is those startups being acquired by larger companies or licensing the technology. And so I think that academic institutions are really learning how to leverage their capabilities, and how to take their discovery and package it a little bit better so that they can get it licensed out. And I think we're finding that probably the middle ground here is being the investment community, the venture capital and angel community is become more tightly associated with universities and being more comfortable with making investments into early spin out technology. And then, you know, its path ultimately to being acquired by larger companies. So I think, I actually think that it's getting better. I think this is a skill that every institution has to learn. And frankly, every entrepreneur potentially who's in those, whether you're an academic professor or you're investigator, needs to learn. But I see it changing pretty dramatically. I think the institutions are more comfortable with the licensing formats. And so they're seeing other universities that are getting comfortable with it. What's kind of expected, I think everyone's a little fearful that they'll potentially license out something for too little. And so they're always going to err on the too much. But as these relationships from particularly the investment community get better and there's more of a track record through time, I think it creates a path that the institutions are much more comfortable with. And at the end of the day, it's about them, you know, getting value out of what the institution's creating, right? It is the bottom line. And so if they can find a path to develop technology, not just to get funding by traditional, you know, NIH or large institutional grants, but they can find a path to get a revenue stream through royalties from the development of technology out, I think it's going to continue to feed the ecosystem.
Okay, anybody else want to jump in before we go to the next question? So we had a grad student ask, what can doctoral students do to bring the Coulter Foundation to their respective universities?
Okay, this one's really easy. 2 years ago, the Coulter Foundation divested from biomedical research opportunities. So there can be no more technology partners. So right now the structure is there are about 20, some have left, so high teens of technology partners. There are two different phases. There are technology partners 1 and technology partner 2s. The technology partner 1s were the universities that jointly set up a $20 million endowment with the Coulter Foundation. That's long been over. Then we became with the TP2. In that program, they gave $5 million to start the Translational Research Partnership in hopes that your university would now pony up money because they saw how impactful it was in the technology partner, the TP1s. But yeah, so it's not possible anymore. They're in their sunset phase for the foundation.
Thank you. Let me see our next question. Pull that up. How can academics monetize the research process? We know the cost of man hours and equipment, but what is the real value of publication or presentation? And is that only measured by a profitable deliverable?
I think that they're both important. I think that discovery and publication is the core of traditional academia, and I think they do add value to the mission of not just the university, but really the mission of what the institutions of academia were built on. to discover, to help society. And so I think that the way to get that information out is to publish. On the other hand, I think the way to monetize often, and the way to actually continue to get the goal, I believe, is to get these developments into patients if you're in the healthcare space, which I think all of us ultimately are, is to find a path. And that finding that path means that the discovery, finding really and flipping it around of asking yourself, what's the application for the discovery? So really asking yourself, not just what things should I work on for discovery, but what problem am I trying to solve? And if I can frame what problem I'm trying to solve with a technology, then I have another option. I can potentially spin it out, from the IP perspective. But often much of what we talk about, the university licensing it out, what's very common at Stanford is the formation of a company just outside the walls of Stanford, where the faculty member is allowed to participate, and they're allowed to participate by having equity in the company. They only spend a small percentage of their time and build a team outside the university environment with that license. And then it's not just about the rewards for the individual, it's another mechanism to get the technology out where now the goal is translation. And by being in translation, then you can resource regulatory and capabilities that you don't have in the university environment to do, because that's geared toward discovery. And so you now have another mechanism, I think, to reach your goal of really building value for patients by being able to then translate it to patients by getting it actually into patient care in a multi-step process, clinical trials, development, intellectual property, further development. So I think if you're a faculty member, both these are really valuable pathways, but they have different goals. And to me, I think that the ability to do both, have a pathway where some of your work's going for basic discovery, but also some of your work is actually geared towards a fundamental problem you're trying to solve, and then framing it that way and trying to get it out to the structure of trying to get it to patient care. To me, both of those are equally valuable. But I do, as someone mentioned earlier, I think there's a real still lack of recognition of how important that pathway is from an academic promotion perspective. And so it isn't something that's valued as much until you get to the publication. And often the publication follows the intellectual property. And so it's time to get the IP in place and such. So you don't have the same speed at developing publications. And so, I think that to continue to teach academia that patents and that translation and getting things licensed out is valuable to society as well, where the goal should be no different than discovery. I think as we continue to augment that pathway, it's going to make these both equally valuable to institutions.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. I think that's one of the unique things that the Culture Foundation teaches in terms of their academic partners is how to change your research in the slightest way, but to frame it as, okay, this is the problem that I'm trying to solve. I've not created all this great technology and now I'm trying to find the problem that it fixes, but thinking about the problem from the very beginning and how to uniquely solve it. And doing it that way, you don't miss much in terms of your normal academic path. It's just framing it a little bit differently to tell a different story.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I mean, going out and looking at what is the problem that you're solving, and what is the financial benefit of that problem that you're solving, and seeing what kind of markets out there for that problem that you're solving, and that can really lead you in a very, very, very strong path, and really understand, what are the financial benefits that you're trying to attack.
Exactly. Good. When we're writing proposals to NIH and NSF, and we're starting out with this introduction, what I've noticed, people that have gone through entrepreneurial training, they tell a totally different story, and they draw in the reader from the very beginning, framing the problem in the capacity for this technology to answer this problem. Whereas oftentimes it's been, okay, this is what this person did in this area, this is what that person did, but now I'm going to marry these two. It's a different story when you it's a more compelling story when you're able to tie into a potential application or a potential problem that you're solving after the research is done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is what, there's several institutions that are teaching this. Coulter, I would echo, is fantastic at this. And it is just a small tweak. It really is. It's just, it's something that not all engineers and scientists feel comfortable with, to be honest, though, you know, a market report. You want me to look at how many people have this problem, you know, to look, but it really is important. And I think that if you can add that small tweak of what you're trying to solve, it changes the entire framework of what potentially the pathway is.
Yeah, I'd like to echo those comments. I have been doing NIH SBIR reviews for the last 4 years, and you can see the difference in the significant statements and how they frame their arguments with those who have actually done development before, and also having that cogent why I'm doing this and what the significance is to solving that healthcare problem is why that's how you get funded in an SBIR. You need to be able to show that you are providing something new, innovative, and something that is absolutely needed. You need to be checking off an unmet need. And that's something that you have to learn you have to learn kind of the language in putting that together.
Guys. So we're starting to wind down. We have one last question. You see, so we've some of the different challenges that were discussed earlier. The question is, where does the training come from to navigate these challenges? Is it just experience working with a professional? And then a third part of that is, are there ways that NSBE HISIG can be a bridge for building some sort of pipeline?
Okay, I can speak a little bit. That's a tough one. I mean, the responsibility is, it's a shared responsibility. In my particular case, when I had finished I think I had finished my postdoc. Part of my postdoc, we were involved with this program called the Partnership for Innovations program at NSF. And it was the precursor to NSF I-Corps. But that program introduced me to a mentor who's been a lifelong mentor. It so happens that he was a Cornell alum and we connected on that point. But since then, he's mentored me through the process. It was always great being able to just have an experienced person behind me to bounce different ideas off, different moves that I was making from my career, but also within the companies that I was trying to start, just because he had been there, done that. I mean, he started out, he's a PhD from Cornell. He had every role in a company from researcher to CEO. And that wealth of information from mentorship is just, it pays so many different dividends. So in the NSF I-Corps Hub grant that we are writing, or we just submitted, that's one of the big portions of it, is that mentorship panel and resources that you're able to surround your entrepreneurs with, because it just pays so many dividends to have people that have been there, done that.
I think to the individuals out there, I think that the ability to develop the skills of, I think we would all call needs-driven innovation, as opposed to kind of tech push innovation. They're both important. There's not one that's more important than the other. But to develop the skills for needs-driven innovation, to really understand, as was mentioned, what really an unmet need is, and how to kind of frame the unmet need. And there's lots of capabilities out there. Coulter teaches in a similar format. I-Corps uses a similar kind of framework. The Biodesign Center at Stanford, we have a textbook that's out that it's readily available that people use across, internationally, and picking that up along the way, just to give yourself a chance to think differently. we're implementing a lot of this now, and now that I've moved out of academia to industry, we're implementing that in industry now. So we actually are trying to move the not just the great engineering that happens in engineering, but really, in industry, but to try and change the frame of start thinking about starting with a problem as developing a technology and figuring out where we can use it out there and what markets potentially will take it. So I think to individuals, there are lots of training programs out there, capabilities, a textbook to potentially go read and go figure out, get these skills. There's seminars, and I think that it's a valuable tool to add to your arsenal of capabilities as an engineer.
Thank you all for commenting. And your last piece that you said there, actually, you must have been, channeling one of our board members had a question. And I noticed, I think all of you had some of this in as you talked about your careers. He wanted someone or any of you to speak on transition between careers in academia and industry, or vice versa, your experience with that.
I can talk a little bit about my transition. So I think one of the most important aspects of being able to transition from your academic world to industry is really understanding how the work that you have done fits into the bigger picture of and being able to articulate how your work can actually solve a clinical unmet need or technological unmet need, whichever your industry is. And that was one of the things, as being on hiring committees and interviewing PhDs coming into the job, coming in to apply for industry jobs, is if the candidate could not articulate how their work could be applied to meet a clinical need, then we moved on from them. So that was really the first step, is being able to understand and articulate how your work can help to move a need.
I would say that, the switch, I transitioned a year and a half ago after 15 years as a professor. I was in industry, I would like to say. I was an entrepreneur. I had started companies as a professor. I was still interacting, but making, quote unquote, the jump. One of my really close colleagues used to say, well, people talk about it as a jump to the dark side, as if it's some kind of different bad place to go to industry from academia. I think, it's the enlightened side in many ways. They're both good. They both have so much to offer. They're both, and one's not right. And I would say I wouldn't think of them as a jump because I think they're just opportunity. And so when you think about moving around in academia through promotion or moving to a different role in academia, I think you're thinking it the same way of moving to industry. But I do think it's a different skill set. You're learning to flex a different muscle. And I think what was mentioned about unmet needs, really understanding what the frame of the problem you're trying to solve. Ultimately, industry's, in my opinion, about translation. It's about translating things into, as opposed to just discovery. And I know we've talked about that a couple different ways, but I think really understanding how different that is helps you say, well, do I want to think about this opportunity? Because the frame of this opportunity is going to be about being a person that's doing translation, as opposed to a person who's doing discovery. You may have a role, I should say, still doing some element of discovery in industry, but the goal overall of industry is translation. And I think you got to recognize what you're doing and what the challenges and the opportunities are for you in either role. And I actually moved from industry to academia, and ultimately 20 years later from academia back to industry. And I think that I hope that I'm thinking that more about not the place I'm at, but more what the opportunity and challenges are. And so, who knows, I may someday move back to academia. I think, but recognizing they're just different challenges and different opportunities.
Thank you. We've got one last question. To what extent Oh, and you all are also, all the attendees will get a session poll that's gonna come up. But our very last question is, that poll came up and blocked my screen. To what extent is industry involved in, and it's in quotation marks, regulating the FDA?
Well,
So-
go ahead. I'm glad you went first.
This will be short and sweet. The FDA is not regulated by industry. Let's just make that really clear. The FDA, my first experience dealing with the FDA, we were preparing an ANDA for an abbreviated new drug application to FDA. And we had a pre-FDA meeting and we thought that we had a plan. And all of a sudden, the FDA changed the plan at the very last minute. And guess what our recourse was? To do exactly what the FDA said and try to get our drug cleared. We can't regulate them. We try to play nice with them because we really always want them on our sides, because as Dr. Brenton mentioned, we're trying to get technologies from laboratory to bedside, and that's one of the relationships that you have to facilitate and navigate. But no, even with lobbyists and all, you don't regulate the FDA. They regulate you, in my opinion.
I'd like to say that I looked on the comments, and our Dr. Aston Ross, who works at the FDA, gave a very succinct answer to that question. She said they don't.
I think one important thing is to make sure you understand their language and where they're coming from, understand their lens, and that can help. At least that can help. I mean, that can help your strategy on how to present to them, work with them, know what their nomenclature is and what they're looking for, and then you can try to mimic that and try to make sure you use their wording, and really be able to form your own strategy with working with them. But you're right, they're going to tell you what to do, and that's right. You got to work with them. That's right.
I think my interactions that you hear from the FDA often are go early and go often. I would echo that to everybody, which is, the FDA is more now than ever a partner, and really understanding what their challenges are, what they're trying to solve for, and so how can we help them do what they need to do to help us get an approval? I think if you think about it that way, it really does become about the relationship. I think that they've made huge changes, particularly CDRH, in the last 5 years with pre-subs, being able to go in and have a discussion and just get some feedback on kind of where you are in the process of developing the technology. The timelines are very different. There was a time, 7 or 8 years ago, one of my colleagues, Josh Macker, wrote a pretty scathing evaluation of the timelines for submission to FDA. And I think that created, Jeff Shern has done an unbelievable job really transforming the way in the process review at the FDA for having this be much more open discussion, and to have it be a partnership towards trying to get, ultimately, what does the FDA want? They want safe and effective, but they want technology to patients. And so, their goal is to get stuff out. They have the same goal we do. It's just making sure that they're safe and effective. So I think the more you think of it as not a huge threshold or barrier, but more of a process of which the earlier the end of the process, and the more questions, the more data you provide, and the more open you are, I feel like the more open they are.
Yeah, I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I do agree with Dr. Brenton. In my experience, it has been more of a partnership, and several different companies that I've worked with in terms of communicating with the FDA. One of the things that I always like to stress is when you do your prepare your communications, be very clear, have a plan. Don't go in with open questions. Go in with already having set together what you believe and what you think. So don't ever send the FDA an open question, because then they'll tell you what to do. What you want to do is kind of have your strategy put together and ask them if they agree with it. And if they don't, then that's when you start it's more of a negotiation and a partnership versus a kind of an adversarial thing.
I agree, and the other regulatory agencies around the global network, they're the same exact way. They want that partnership, and I agree. Make sure you have a strategy, and make sure that you work hard up front and know exactly how you're going to present your information and be ready for those different scenarios. That's important.
Thank you all. Thank you for that last answer, and thank you for taking time out of your day to participate in our panel. I really appreciate it. If you all have any opportunities at your individual workplaces, please feel free to share those via email, and we can help you with disseminating that amongst our members. As I kind of stated at the onset, we have 4,800, and then of course there's the greater NSBE organization as well. And I wanted to let everybody know, in addition to the poll you just got, there is over in the chat, you'll see there is a brief session feedback survey that you can complete. And I wanted to share my screen with you all, just give you, put in a plug for our upcoming event this afternoon. If you want to come and hear about how Zipline is going to reach its mission of providing every human access to medical supplies instantly, you can come to our drones and healthcare session this afternoon between 2 and 3:20 p.m. Central Standard Time. So I'll stop sharing that. And just thank you again to everybody. Thank you to all the attendees, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Sims.
Thanks.
Thank you.